long time ago, in a galaxy not so far away, LucasArts was known for its stellar point-and-click style adventure games. Though their first effort in the genre was an adaptation of the 1986 film Labyrinth, it was their next offering that set the template for future projects, the comically named Scum engine. The game that first made use of this new engine was 1987's Maniac Mansion for the Commodore 64. Maniac Mansion was the brainchild of Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick. It blended a bizarre sci-fi tale with cheesy horror tropes to produce an experience unlike anything seen at the time. Critics applauded its ambitious design, which allowed players to switch between 3 characters and achieve multiple endings. After the game received much praise, LucasArts decided to port the game over to other platforms, including the NES. The NES port would be published by Jaleco, but LucasArts staff was concerned about giving this port the proper attention. That's when Douglas Crockford, a member of the LucasArts staff, volunteered to helm the project, one that saw Tim Schafer get his first official start in the industry as a game tester on the NES version. The first step was making graphical and technical adjustments to get the game running on the NES. After accomplishing this, Jaleco USA President Howard Rubin consulted with Crockford about Nintendo's infamous NES game standards policy and what content would probably need to be altered in order to get approval. We reached out to Mr. Crockford to get several statements for this episode, one of which addressed the original version of Maniac Mansion for the NES that supposedly had nothing censored and has been found floating around in the form of a prototype. Regarding this original, uncensored version, that was the version that we intended to ship. We submitted that version to Nintendo and they refused to manufacture it for us unless we censored it. We didn't put anything into the first version attempting to get anything past Nintendo. Everything in it was already in the C64 and PC versions. We were attempting to produce a high-fidelity port of a successful and popular game. A month after submitting, Nintendo of America provided a report with a list of objectionable content that LucasArts had to change. Some of these included alterations to key elements of the game, like a bit of graffiti that provided a clue to solve a puzzle. Others were even more ridiculous, like Nintendo's objection to the use of the term NES Scum, the name of the NES port's engine, listed in the credit sequence. LucasArts made the changes and then resubmitted Maniac Mansion for approval. Nintendo was pleased with the result and ordered 250,000 cartridges be manufactured. Nintendo then announced the port in Volume 14 of Nintendo Power, and later gave its release coverage with a cover feature in Volume 16. The NES port was on its way, but it wasn't the end of this game's censorship woes. Mr. Crockford would eventually go on record commenting about the confusing nature of the NES game standards policy. He cited the inclusion of the ability for the player to obtain a hamster in the game and place it into a microwave as an example of something Nintendo allowed. While this slipped past the Nintendo censors originally, the Big N later noticed it and demanded it be removed from future versions. It's that very request that is the subject of our mystery this time. While it's well documented that Nintendo asked for the hamster scene to be removed, what's been argued over the years is whether or not a new, censored version of the game saw the light of day. Before diving into this mystery, we wanted to see the hamster exploding in the microwave for ourselves. In order to do this, we had to first gain entrance into the mansion and then make our way up the floors to Weird Ed's room. Doing this requires you to not only distract Ed in order to get past him unnoticed, but also obtain the necessary food and beverage to pacify the green tentacle and gain access to the floor with Ed's room. Once you enter Ed's room, pick up the hamster and then head back down to the first floor. Go through the door on the left of the staircase to enter the kitchen. Approach the microwave and place the hamster inside. Close the door, and then turn the microwave on to see the fireworks. You'll then be left with an exploded hamster that you can pick up and take with you. As for versions where this supposedly isn't possible, there have been numerous claims over the years from people who say they couldn't microwave the hamster in their copy of the game. Others claim there never was another version released in North America. After looking into the matter more closely, it seems both explanations might be right. Our search first brought us to a posting about an excerpt from the Digital Press Video Game Collector's Guide, published back in 2002. The text mentions the ability to microwave the hamster in the US version, but goes on to say this trick was allegedly taken out of later carts by Jaleco, but all NTSC carts still let you do it. PAL ones don't. Though it's a published work, the statement is at best hearsay. However, the mention of the PAL version piqued our interest, since it raised the possibility that the censorship happened in overseas versions of the game. Before proceeding any further, we decided to play through the PAL version of Maniac Mansion and see if microwaving the hamster was possible or not. We performed the same steps as we did in the US version, but to our surprise, the game wouldn't allow us to microwave the hamster. The theory that microwaving the hamster was only removed in PAL versions is further supported in another source. In Imagine Publishing's Retro Volume 3, released in 2010, on page 25 there's a column about content left on the cutting room floor for Maniac Mansion. The text contains an excerpt that states, "Ironically, Nintendo of America failed to remove the most offensive scene, in which the player is able to microwave a pet hamster to death. The mistake was noticed just in time to stop it being included in the PAL version, however." While these were all published sources, some of which interviewed the LucasArts development team, there were no direct quotes attributed to the second version of Maniac Mansion. So we decided to try to talk to some of the key members of Maniac Mansion staff to get a definitive statement. Recently, we had Tim Schafer, now the founder and creative director of Double Fine, come into our offices to discuss his studio's latest release, Broken Age. We took a few minutes of his time to chat with him about the NES port and the exploding hamster.
In the original Maniac Mansion, someone way before I got to LucasArts decided to put a hamster in a microwave, and it was probably Ron Gilbert or Gary Winnick had that idea. And that was their game, and I came on, I had a very minor part in the NES version. They had all those scumlets that they call us at the time, just shove around the little object tags to adjust them from the Commodore 64 to the Nintendo version. So I don't know a lot of the, if those guys didn't like hamsters or what led to that. But as far as I know, it went into the Nintendo version, and all the versions of it have you microwaving a hamster, and that made it in. Even though I remember they made them take out, there was like a naked lady statue and a Coke machine, and a lot of things that got taken out. But the hamster you could still microwave.
We followed Mr. Schafer's suggestion and got in contact with Ron Gilbert to inquire about the second version, as well as a few other topics. Mr. Gilbert had the following to say. "I don't know if the second NES version was ever released. I was surprised that they allowed the hamster scene in the first version given all the other censorship they did, mostly due to suggestive stuff, not violence. By the time the NES version made it onto shelves, I was doing Monkey Island, so I wasn't following it that closely. The hamster was David Fox's idea. I don't remember exactly how Nintendo reviewed content. Doug Crockford was the one who managed the conversion. It all happened a good year or two after the original C64 game came out." Ron's statement revealed that the exploding hamster was courtesy of David Fox, the primary script programmer on Maniac Mansion. While he wasn't sure if the second NES version was ever released, he indicated that Douglas Crockford would be the authority on this matter. Mr. Crockford was quick to reply to our inquiry, giving us a brief but direct answer regarding the second NES version. The first version of Maniac Mansion had the exploding hamster. Nintendo found out about it and asked that it be removed by the next edition. We complied, but I don't know if that version ever got to manufacturing. Along with seeing the censored PAL version with our own eyes, we now had first-hand confirmation from the head of the NES port project about the existence of a second version. Unfortunately, Mr. Crockford did not know if that version ever went into manufacturing, specifically in the US. After reviewing the statements from the developer and the information from the various books, it seems clear that a second version of the NES port of Maniac Mansion only saw the light of day overseas. Yet we still lacked a confirmation that there was only a single printing of Maniac Mansion in the US. While highly unlikely, it is still possible there was a second shipment with the exploding hamster removed. We know for a fact this version ended up in PAL territories. However, this wasn't true of the Japanese version, which not only included the ability to microwave the hamster, but looked drastically different than any other version. Something just wasn't adding up. Other than a Nintendo of America employee that's likely long since left the company, the only person who might know about the possibility of a second print of Maniac Mansion would be former Jaleco USA President Howard Rubin. Unfortunately, we were unable to get in touch with Mr. Rubin. We were about to close the cover on this mystery when our copy of The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen Kent arrived. Published in 2001, this tome is a treasure trove of developer quotes and other original research. Of particular interest is an anecdote on page 363 in the chapter entitled The New Empire. Mike Myers, former product manager for Jaleco USA, discusses the infamous exploding hamster trick. He goes over the instructions for performing the hamster trick, but then he dives into something far more intriguing. You had to sneak into a character named Weird Ed's room and steal his hamster. You could then run down to the kitchen undetected and put the hamster in the microwave oven, at which point the hamster would explode into a little charred mess, complete with sound effects. Then you could hand the charred hamster back to Weird Ed. That actually was one of the only ways you could die in Maniac Mansion. If you pulled off that trick, you would end up as a little tombstone, and then you could move around the game as an invisible ghost-like character. It was just one of those nice little tricks that was buried in the game, and it was buried so well that they never found it until the first 250,000 copies had sold. When we did the second run, they made us change it. Mr. Myers mentions a second run after the first edition sold out. While he could have simply been referring to the second version that eventually shipped to PAL territories, this was a lead we had to follow, so we contacted Mr. Myers, who now runs MMPR, to see if he could confirm once and for all whether or not the second version was released in the US.
The first run of Maniac Mansion for the Nintendo Entertainment System was about 250,000 copies, and just as that shipment was going to retail, Nintendo of America discovered that we had left the infamous exploding hamster trick buried within the game. They basically told us that if we wanted to manufacture any more copies of the game, that trick had to be removed. So we did end up removing the trick and putting out another couple 100,000 copies of the game. The first 250,000 copies sold very quickly because news got out, leaked, that the trick was still in the game. The Japanese version of LucasArts' Maniac Mansion actually was created first, which is why the exploding hamster trick is still in that version. Unfortunately, LucasArts' American humor didn't translate very well to Japan, and they didn't really understand a lot of the jokes that were buried within the game. Subsequently, the game did not do very well in Japan.
Mr. Myers also added that he's still in contact with former Jaleco USA President Howard Rubin. He reached out to Mr. Rubin to reconfirm the second version of the NES port made its way onto store shelves in the US. We finally had confirmation that there was indeed a second print of Maniac Mansion in the US with the exploding hamster removed, as well as an explanation for why the Japanese version looks so different and contained censored content like the exploding hamster. In the end, the story behind the censorship of Maniac Mansion turned out to be just as strange and mysterious as the game itself. But thanks to the former staff members at LucasArts, Jaleco, and other curious minds, we have a happy ending for this intriguing tale.